All right, thanks and welcome everybody.
We're excited to be here. Thanks, guys. This is our first ever office hours experience, so we're looking at data today. We're looking at backing up that data, and we've taken some questions prior, and so we've kind of grouped those questions ahead of time to make it a little simpler. So I think one of the first ways to start off to jump in here is some of the considerations. Why does the cloud make any sense at all for doing backup, and why should I go that direction? What are the benefits and what are the cost advantages? Rowan, want to give us some ideas?
Yeah, so there are a tremendous amount of advantages to backing up data to the cloud, right? So AWS provides extremely durable data stores for you to be able to back your data up to. This is extremely advantageous because you don't have to go and manage your data stores like you do on premise. You don't have to manage infrastructure. The data store can grow almost infinitely. And all you really have to do is target your backups to those data stores. But along with that, you also get all of the baked-in security and scalability of our global infrastructure, and just sorry.
Is it simple? Is it easy?
Yeah, it's extremely simple, right? So very simple. Like I said, you don't have to manage. You don't have to manage anything. You really just have to decide what the right data store is for your backup, and then how you want to restore your data. But because of the capabilities in AWS, not just the data stores, all of the other capabilities around compute, you can also extend your backup capabilities to a full-on DR strategy. Okay. So you can really just kind of think forward around what you want to do.
If you're already planning on going to the cloud, that sort of dovetails really nicely.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many people out there who actually just run secondary data centers because that's their failover site, or that's the place where they've got their backups. And if you've never failed over, if you don't have an automated way to fail over, if you're just running that site, effectively as a replication target, it's for a lot of folks that's a waste. And so applying your backup strategy to manage infrastructure environment makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
How about security? That's always a question. Is it secure in transit? Is it secure once it gets there? What are things that you should think about?
Yeah, so absolutely. So in transit, either via partner software or using our APIs, data's encrypted, right? HTTPS protocols are used to transfer that data to AWS. When data gets on AWS, we have encryption capabilities for data at rest. So when you land your data in, say, S3, you can use server-side encryption to keep that data safe. You can use our KMS capabilities to manage your keys for encrypting that data. You can bring your own keys. So you have multiple levels at which you can decide how to implement your compliance and security requirements.
We even have some partners who use data keys, which is where for every object that gets uploaded, there's a new key that gets generated from KMS. And the sort of the public version of that key is kept inside of the metadata of the object. So you get 3 layers right there. You get your policy for at rest, you get the data key for the object itself, and you get TLS. So for customers who have, especially large customers who have hundreds or potentially thousands of accounts, the way that they manage their IAM policies across accounts, across services, using very granular role definitions, allow them to really limit their blast radius in the case of user error or bad actor scenarios.
So Mark just threw a question out here, and it leads right into where we're headed. Automating this stuff, making sure that it happens. So let's leave the on-prem piece out of the picture right now. We'll get to that in a moment. So if I'm just using AWS, how do I make sure that this stuff happens and that I can get it back and that I don't have to go through a lot of manual labor here?
Yeah, sure. So we already intrinsically on the AWS platform, you can very easily automate either deployment of your backup infrastructure or implementation of policies. So you can easily use our CloudFormation templating capability to automatically deploy exactly the configuration you need. So securing the network exactly how you need to with security groups, implementing the correct policies on your buckets, and then essentially writing out exactly who, from an IAM perspective, has access to those buckets or data inside those buckets. That can all be deployed at the push of a button, right? Once your template is written, you can deploy the template to instantiate or the environment, to enhance the environment. So if you need to grow the environment.
And it's reproducible.
And it's reproducible, right? Yeah. I need to now deploy this in another region, right? Because my operations have expanded. Great.
Okay.
Deploy that same template in that other region.
Copy your AMIs that are relevant
copy
to
your AMIs.
there, update your AMI IDs in the file, and away you go.
And away you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how about more narrowly, not just deploying the environment, but managing the backups? Do we have a console and a scheduler inside of AWS, or do I use something else for that?
So we have some data protection scheduling capabilities, and of course, if you had something that you just wanted to do ad hoc schedules with, we actually have interval-based Lambda calls that you can make to script things together. But if you were using, let's say, one of our technology partner solutions, right, like a Net Backup or a Backup Exec or Commvault or TSM or something like that, they have policies in there as well, and a lot of them use not only their own KMS, some of them integrate with our KMS, but they also are tied into federated identity systems. So it's often the case that, especially enterprises, but down to SMB, that when they deploy in the cloud, they're not using a different federated identity system in the cloud than what they're using on-prem, right? It's an extension of like an AD Forest or something like that.
Okay.
And so we have partners in that regard as well to help glue things together. But the general idea is that if you have policies today, you get to maintain those policies. But what you get in addition to that is you get the ability to, in a very, very large scale, have access to protecting things that you may not have any authority over. So the problem of the backup administrator on-prem is, and specifically related to security, maybe you have some InfoSec policies that say nobody can access these machines. If you're the backup administrator and you're responsible for protecting that data, that's problematic for you because you don't have any authority over it, so you can't do anything with it. In AWS, we have the ability to specify very fine-grained IAM policies, roles, right? Role definitions and policies. So a backup administrator can actually protect workloads that are running in the cloud without having access to them. And that's really key for really large environments. If you have hundreds or thousands of accounts and thousands of systems, and you've got one backup administrator, the only way to make that scale is if you can deploy consistently across all these environments in an automated fashion. And so to that end, we have APIs for every single one of those components. And some of our technology partners are even API driven. So Commvault in particular has quite a good set of APIs.
So before we move on to talking about on-prem and blending these two together, you touched on something that I think is important. The ratio, one person managing thousands of data protection problems or environments. What's a good way to think about the cost benefits here of AWS in terms of the ratio of people and processes?
You want to talk about some of the assumptions that people fail to make?
Well, yeah. So let me get, kind of throw out a scenario, right? So a common backup task. An operational test. So I have tape, it's LTO6, it's 2 generations old right now. LTO has been refreshed roughly every 2 to 3 years. I have to refresh all that tape probably next year after, into when the next LTO comes out, right? LTO 8. So that task can be pretty time intensive, right? Even if we have machines to do the tape copies, just some rough math, if I wanted to back up a petabyte of effective data on premise and I did weekly fulls and then let's say incrementals that were about 10% of the initial data set size, it's about 50 petabytes a year of data that gets backed up to tape.
And that's assuming that your backup workload doesn't
right.
interfere with the tape slots that you're going to need, the tape drives that you're going to need in order to do your refreshes.
And so I'm just kind of throwing rough math out there, right? So let's say 50 petabytes, I have to refresh those tapes. How many tapes do I have? If it was LTO 6, I probably have a couple thousand tapes, maybe more. And I have to go and get those tapes from LTO 6 to the newest media. Mm-hmm. So even let's say best case, I've got full 2.5 to 1 compression, and I'm replicating those tapes with special hardware to replicate all those tapes. It could still take me anywhere from 130 to 260 days to replicate that amount of data.
Yep.
That task goes away when you move your data to the cloud, right? You don't have to go through and every couple of years figure out how to go and refresh that tape. And then, and really, it's a continuous process for you.
Yeah.
It's another task that you're spending time on. You could be spending time doing something else, like enhancing your backup, your disaster recovery strategy.
Yeah. And it's a stair step on the cost side too, right?
It absolutely is. Yeah.
If I have a tape library and I run out of tape slots, I got to go buy another library.
Yeah. It's not quite a hidden cost. It's a cost that you may not talk about up front, right? You may talk about, well, the cost of storing data on tape is 1 cent per terabyte.
The dollar per gigabyte ratio.
But when you think about the actual transition, having to transition those tapes, or in some industries, the tapes have to be transcribed. On kind of the extreme end, I've seen customers and talked to customers who said it costs me roughly $20 a tape to transcribe them.
All in. Oh, wow.
And I have 1 million tapes that I have to transcribe. I generate a lot of data. Yeah. And I have to keep a lot of data.
Yeah.
So, these are big numbers. It's very significant what you have to do just for that process. And when you move your data to the cloud, a lot of that goes away, operational overhead.
So you lose the operational overhead, but you also lose the risk, because magnetic tape, other than the fact that there's only one tape manufacturer, as Mike Davis and BD likes to remind us, what's the risk of that? But there's also the range of, you probably ought to start looking at replacing that tape in like a 7 to 10 year time frame. That's a statistical thing. So you could get there at year 6 and your data's gone.
Your mileage may vary on the tape, right?
Yeah.
It could last 30 years. It could last 3.
It's really hard to say. So all that risk goes away because it's now in a highly durable storage.
That's right.
Right. And then there's also the simplicity of it, right? I mean, just there's fewer things to go wrong when somebody's not handling something.
Let's talk about real life practices here. Like, how does that simplicity come in? So we went to great lengths to make some extraordinary artistic productions
Lifelike.
here. Yeah. And
I can see the trees.
People are already asking about the markers. If it comes to it, we'll whip out the markers. But we tried to get a jump on things. So this is a sketch of a way to think about ways to take advantage of your existing infrastructure and then easily augment that with the cloud or blend the cloud into the mix. So on the left-hand side here is our on-prem world. We've got a host layer, some disk in the middle, and then ultimately it's getting backed up to tape. And then probably you're backing up those disks to another set of disks sitting in another location. Then eventually that data may end up on tape sitting over in some mountainous sort of company location. And ultimately there's a cloud sitting out there beyond all that. So how do we start to bring these two things together and then maybe even to what we were saying, get rid of the tape entirely? What's a good way to start here?
Yeah, sure. So let's start, kind of the simplest approach. So let's assume the backup software and product you use has a connector that can talk to AWS natively.
And that's pretty much everybody today.
There you go. So we can use that connector without changing anything on-prem. As long as you have connectivity to AWS, the connector can start writing backups to AWS.
So straight from my backup host, right over into the cloud.
Right over into the cloud, okay. Correct.
So you can do it directly from the on-prem, or if you wanted to, you could do it from site too. Either one.
As a disk to cloud model. Got it.
So you want to do things in a very non-disruptive fashion. If you've got a 2-site disk to tape type configuration, then use your secondary site and start testing it. Right. Very, very easy first step. Let's start getting our operational muscle in order to actually figure out how to do the backup to the cloud and then how to do the restores, and get an idea of how long that takes via the connectivity you have, right? So you can do some planning there, pretty simple. Let's look at the case where maybe I'm doing something like an RMAN type backup, right? Okay. So how do I actually go and do that backup in a seamless way without changing too much in my environment? Well, if I have the licensing for Oracle Secure Backup, then especially the cloud module, then I can just, again, in a native fashion, direct backups to S3. So again, all you really need to worry about is your connectivity.
Yeah.
And of course, whether or not that connectivity can support the recovery time objective and for any sort of resource that may need to happen.
But there are variables here. So the connector gives you instant hybrid. Mm-hmm. You get a caching layer here. If you've already invested in this, you can keep that. Or you could keep a cache over here for the fast restores. And then you get the ultimate long-term archive out here. Pretty simple way to start.
It is. And if you are on an older version of software that doesn't have a connector, because those do exist, right?
Those do exist.
Then probably like 99% of the time you have a VTL connector. A VTL initiator. So, which brings us to our next cardboard.
We can try this one out.
So if you don't have a connector, then you need a gateway, right?
Yeah.
Once upon a time, no software had connectors, and everybody used a gateway. And we have a product for that.
Yeah, so AWS provides a storage gateway. Storage gateway can operate in 3 modes, file, volume, and VTL. So like we were saying,
one of those 3 modes.
One of those 3 modes, yeah. So
But it's just a virtual machine. I mean, you can deploy multiple.
You can deploy it as needed, right?
And it sits on-prem or in the cloud?
Either.
Either.
So it's again depends on the pattern you want to utilize for doing the backups. But by presenting a file, a volume, or a VTL target, again, your software, if it doesn't already support a cloud connector, can now in its native format choose to direct the backups to the VTL or choose to direct the backups to a file endpoint, and those backups are then copied up to the cloud via the gateway into S3. So that gives you a fairly seamless, again, very seamless way of deploying a storage gateway via virtual machine on-prem or in the cloud, and then pointing your backup software at that target. And really, it's kind of a fire and forget at that point. The gateway will take care of making sure the data is replicated to the cloud.
And we have customers who are using not just VTL mode, but are also using volume or also using file, right? We've had customers who have done all of those things with their backup workloads.
Let's talk about that. So what's the advantage to the VTL mode?
You don't have to change anything that you're doing except it's going to virtual tape instead of physical tape. Yep.
And
so you still have that tape concept. You still have all your tape labels. And initially it lands in S3, and then we have APIs, but you can also go through the console to say, okay, I want to archive that tape, which means it gets transitioned into Glacier.
So I could do a similar thing with a file gateway, right?
You could, totally. Yeah, usually I would say that applications that write to file systems tend to expect that that data is going to be there, and backup systems in particular tend to go and poke at things to say, are you still there? And so if you were using file gateway, I would expect that you wouldn't initially know what your hot data set is or how to size the cache.
Right.
But if you were trying to do a migration of virtual machines, for example, and you had something that didn't have a native S3 connector, you could use file gateway to write out those virtual machine files. So, for example, Veeam today doesn't support S3 natively.
No connector.
No connector, yeah. And we have customers, publicly referenceable customers, who have used file gateway to effectively use Veeam to export their virtual machines into S3 and then import them.
And of course, Veeam would work, since it's generic, it could work writing as a tape backup to the VTL as well.
Yeah, I think there's a VTL connector in there as well. Yeah. And that S3 connector is coming with Veeam real soon now. Right? We've been working on it with them for a while now. I think that's one of the few that actually doesn't have an S3 connector. But if you're using Spectrum Protect or Spectrum Protect Plus, the TSM lineage, if you're using EMC Networker with Cloud Boost, if you're using
Veritas,
Commvault, and not only Veritas Net Backup, but also Backup Exec now has an S3 connector. All of these things have the ability to write directly to the cloud, and it works pretty well. And some of them have things like dedupe. Oh, and I can't forget Cloudberry. Cloudberry is used by so many people. These solutions often have advanced features in them: compression, dedupe, that sort of thing.
So we've got two questions in here, one from Promote and one from Larry on smaller businesses where, it's not a scale problem so much as just a management problem. How do I connect something that is a simple place to drop data that then automatically shows up in S3?
So, it comes down to, is it a backup or is it just a copy of your data? Sometimes it's simpler to just say, I've got some data that maybe they're just files and I just need to copy them into the cloud. And that's where something like File Gateway gets really easy. Yeah. File Gateway solves 90+% of the I have objects in S3 and I want to interact with them as files kinds of problems. And then if you have a desire to have a quote-unquote real backup solution, but you don't want to spend a lot of money or you don't have a lot of data, you don't need a massively scalable system, things like Backup Exec and Cloudberry are very popular. Backup Exec, the average Backup Exec user has less than a terabyte of data that they're going to back up.
Sure.
And we have some municipal public references around Cloudberry where the budget savings was I think it was like $800 a year or something like that, which for that municipality was huge because they had, it's a town, right? It's not like a technology company,
right?
And they needed something that was just bulletproof and that would get the data into S3 and would enable them to move it to Glacier over time. So Cloudberry is a great solution for that.
Yeah, I'll add one thing, right, for the smaller businesses, right? So File Gateway operates, File Gateway can present NFS and SIFs. So simple interfaces.
So SIFs for
Pause for a
Windows.
second. Walk me through basically a file gateway and how I drop that in and how it connects so that I can understand the flow here.
Yep. So you download our AMI, and
You start out on the console.
get started on the console. Download our AMI, and you'll have to spin that up on your virtual infrastructure
As a VM.
on-prem as
Okay.
a VM.
Yeah, either Hyper-V or VMware.
Yep. And you need to configure the file gateway. You need to configure the gateway as a file gateway. And then select what type of share or export you want to present, right? So you can present a SMB share or an NFS export. From there, your host can write to that endpoint, and the gateway is going to optimize the upload of those files. So in the situation where we are going to write our files just as is as a copy, right? And we're not really aware of doing incremental or differential type of updates to the gateway. We're just copying files to it. The gateway is going to do a multi-part upload to AWS, and it's going to ensure to optimally use the bandwidth to get that data up to AWS. So you don't have to worry too much about, do I have enough bandwidth, or does like how long is it going to take the gateway will asynchronously copy that data up.
If you do want to know that, we have a workflow for that
Absolutely.
that Storage Gateway supports, so you can see that in a CloudWatch event.
Yeah, so it like the question said, right? It really kind of depends on where you are in your maturity and what data you need, how you want to manage, and how much you want to manage.
Okay.
And you can kind of be selective from there as far as what you want to do.
But the bottom line is copy paste, drop it on the gateway, and then it shows
then it
up in
goes.
S3.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I got all this durability and all this scale, and I never
Yeah,
think about
especially
it
if you don't need, policies, or if you don't have multiple users.
Right.
I think frequently about when somebody says small business, I think they have a file share that's running off of maybe a box running Windows, and their IT budget is extremely small, and they need something that's going to work and not require training. That's one component.
Yeah.
So whatever it is, it has to be self-evident on how to use it, and then they need something that isn't going to give them a lot of cost overhead, where they're going to end up, ransomed to a license and support fees.
So we talked about hybrid, we talked about partners and integrating, we talked about leveraging the stuff we have. Last thing before we move on is probably what I like to think of as the Trojan Horse. Like what we just described in a backup scenario with that file gateway is essentially a cloud migration.
For that
Under the
data
covers.
set, for sure.
That data set,
Yeah.
yep. Yeah,
So
definitely.
you turn around and you look at your backups and you say, I'm going to turn this in, I'm going to spin up a new AMI, move my host, point it at that data, now I'm up and running.
That's
Yeah.
actually the beauty of being able to run Storage Gateway inside of your VPC, is that you access it exactly the same way.
Exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now the backup admin becomes kind of an unsung hero in the migration story, right? So you can seed your backup, seed the data to the cloud using your backup software and backup infrastructure, and then when you're ready to migrate, your data is already there. So all you're really looking at is ensuring that you bring up your host, exactly how how it needs to be brought up in the cloud. So this basically streamlines that whole process of how do I go from just backing up to the cloud to how do I really get workloads moved into the cloud and migrate to the cloud.
And the same thing applies to virtual machines. If you go back to the other card, the one that shows the backup infrastructure.
Get that.
So the computers, the hosts, they're on-prem in this, but if you've backed the data up into AWS and you spin up a media server in AWS, then you can restore from S3 very, very quickly onto an EC2 instance. And not only did you not have to buy the equipment, you didn't have to wait for it to be delivered, and you didn't have to rack it and stack it, and you didn't have to get the networking guy to do his thing, and you didn't have to get the cabling guy to do his thing, and you didn't have to worry about licenses because you can pay for those as part of the deployment process.
Colo space.
Yeah, so I mean, traditionally, like bare metal restores are kind of a big deal, and they become completely trivial to execute inside of AWS once you've backed up the data.
And how do I easily deploy my third-party software, my Veritas or whatever, up here? Do we have it prepackaged? Is it available as an Omni?
Yeah, actually, so you can get it from most of the vendors. They have Omnis that they deploy to people. In some cases, you can get it off of the marketplace. In some cases, there's quick starts. But the other thing is that if you're a customer, like let's say you're a Commvault customer, you can download the software and you can install it on an EC2 host.
Okay.
You can configure it to talk to your comm cell. And then when you've got things configured the way you want them, take an EBS snapshot. Save it as an Omni, right? You want to take a snapshot of that host. And if you don't need to run it up there all the time, that's okay. You can turn it off. These enterprise backup systems are designed to handle the scenarios where a media server might exist in another office or something like that, and might temporarily go offline, those kinds of things.
All right, and then last clarification: when you look here at the from an S3 bucket into a Glacier bucket, I put the snowflake there. It tells me that it's a Glacier. How do I manage that lifecycle transition? Is it automated? Do I have to back up once in this one and once in the other one?
So if you're writing the data yourself, if you're writing an application, or if you're scripting the migration of data into something like File Gateway, then you control the policy around how old something should be before it gets put in there. Or if you're writing an application, you can say, I want the storage class to be, let's say, S3IA, and then you could have a policy that moves it to Glacier. The features that you might want to take advantage of that you would get by writing directly to Glacier are things like vault lock, which aren't supported via lifecycle policy. And so that's a specialized use case for people who have compliance
worm requirements.
Yeah.
Like financial services or healthcare.
For sure. And there's a lot of workarounds there too, right? There's worm, but there's also enterprise worm as well, right? So enterprise worm, you could apply MFA on the delete operation.
Delete. And versioning.
Yeah. And so, think twice before you go do that, because then you have to do MFA for a lot of objects. But if you needed S3 semantics, then MFA delete is a great way to get worm on S3. And then if the application that you're using to write to the S3 bucket is a technology partner, then they can manage they can guide you through the best practices for doing it, and they can manage the transition in some cases as well.
So I don't have to write to one to the other. I don't have to think about that.
No,
my vendor will
just
do it
set
for
up a
me.
policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if I'm using the VTL, it automatically stages.
It
I can tell
stages it in
stage.
S3, and then you can tell it to archive.
Okay.
It's really one click, and if you're using the VTL.
Okay, good. I think that gets us current with the questions. Let's jump on here a little bit more on best practices. Deduplication, minimizing data loss, versioning, etc. How do I, once I put it in the cloud, how do I make sure that it's still going to be safe?
Well, it's going to be durable if you put it in S3 or if you put it in Glacier. The durability is outstanding.
Yeah, but that's just for the one piece of data that I wrote there for that one object.
Yeah. So are you asking, like, how do you protect against software mess ups or user mess ups?
Accidental deletions, malicious deletions, viruses, security problems.
Yeah, so we can do a couple of things. So we can implement versioning, right? So versioning plus, like we mentioned, MFA delete. We can also replicate that data, if need be, to another site that has a different IAM profile. So users who can manage and write backups to the primary site can't necessarily manage or do anything at the secondary site. All of that can be protected via encryption as well, right? So and the replication can be set up in an automated fashion with cross-region replication inside of S3. So there are a few different ways, like, to kind of go attack that problem, essentially, of protecting it.
The dedupe one is an interesting thing, because everybody wants their bills to be lower. Dedupe is funny because when you think about dedupe, doing dedupe in S3 and then keeping the dedupe component when you send stuff to Glacier is actually quite hard. Almost everybody supports dedupe these days. You get dedupe natively via Cloud Catalyst. If you're on the Veritas Net Backup portfolio, you get dedupe that you can enable in Commvault. TSM, which is Spectrum Protect, does dedupe. There are third-party ways to do dedupe. If you have other technology partners, in fact, StoreReduce is my favorite, but they just got bought
As of this week.
so
change there.
Yeah, so if you're an existing customer, you're great, and if you're not an existing customer, I don't know what to tell you. But there's there are ways to do dedupe, and then we also have traditional dedupe solutions, right? Like Data Domain Virtual Edition on AWS, right? Where not only does it provide the traditional data domain dedupe ratio, but it also lets you tier to S3. So if you wanted that to be a target for your backup system, you could deploy that in AWS just like you would deploy it on-prem, except on demand, right? So significantly less upfront cost.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of the best practices that you follow on-prem, you'd also kind of need to think about following in the cloud. So we've been talking about deduping, but we should also talk about how you're going to restore data. So how much data should I have cached on Prem? How frequently am I restoring files? What
at what
percentage
scale?
and at what scale? What percentage of my total backups am I would I potentially be restoring? That'll help reduce the cost even further because you're not going to have to worry about egressing either full volume backups or egressing tons and tons of files across the network. So you really want to kind of just go through that same thought process around what do I really need immediately? Like what do I need in the next 30 to 45 days? And everything else, for the most part, I know I can offload to AWS.
And when people make recovery plans, right,
Yeah.
restore plans, they think about what am I going to need in that first hour?
Yep.
What am I going to need 2 hours after that, 4 hours after that? And so if what you need to restore has some dependencies, maybe you don't stick it in dedupe, right? Because you just
Right.
created another dependency for yourself. Could be a bottleneck.
Yep.
Depends on your data. Some data, the churn rate of the unique data is so high that things like dedupe don't apply at all. It depends on the data
Yeah.
format. If you have like media files or if you have genomics data or something like that, compression is going to get you a lot farther than dedupe is.
Yeah.
And so knowing your data helps. Sometimes backup administrators don't know the data, but a lot of times they do. And so because there's agents, there's a way to do it agentless as well, right? Leveraging EBS snapshots. But if you have an agent deployed on an instance in AWS or on Prem, you might have a file-based agent, you might have an application-aware agent, a database agent,
Right.
and there's usually specialized logic in each one of those agents to make sure that A, you're getting point-in-time consistent results, and that B, you're optimizing the compression. We even have technology partners that specialize in doing like stateful backup and restores of things like Cassandra clusters, right?
Nice.
If you have a workload that's using some sort of off-the-shelf software, chances are there's a way to back it up.
Yeah. And also, so you also just keep in mind your RPO and RTO, right? So if an agent-based backup is going to help you meet your recovery point objective or your recovery time objective, great, continue using that. But maybe you've hit a point like there's just a high change rate or
Or you need to recover too many hosts at once.
Yeah, you need to recover too many hosts at once. Maybe you need to use snapshot capabilities when you're running that workload in the cloud.
Something less granular might benefit you.
It may benefit you, right? You can get back in online right away without having to figure out what those files are and what order I need to bring them back in. I know it.
Sometimes the stuff that helps you with RPO works against you with RTO.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So the things that like they're multiplexing technology that allow you to be very efficient in the stuff that you send over the wire takes longer to tease apart when you're doing the restore.
Exactly.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you're like a financial institution and backup and restore is supposed to protect you not just against failure of machines or sites, but also against situations like ransomware, then you're going to have very, very granular backups, and you're going to keep them for a long time because you don't know which pieces you're going to have to restore. And in a transactional system or in a series of transactional systems that are interconnected, it's often the case that doing a blanket restore operation is going to hurt you more than help you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of the biggie, right? I want to move my backups to AWS. Great. How do I seed it?
Yes.
I've got a ton of data. How am I going to seed it? So we do provide capabilities to help seed that data. Actually, right? You can copy.
This is a bandwidth question.
It's a bandwidth question, right? You may not be able to copy petabytes of data up to AWS in a reasonable amount of time to even start using AWS as a backup target. But you could use one of our import-export capabilities, right? You could use our Snowball, populate that with data, send it up, seed that data, and then just do incrementals from there forward. Some backup applications will understand how to do that. Otherwise, you may have to essentially figure out how to export those backups and then re-import them on the other side. But just be very conscious of that, right? How you're actually just going to seed it and get started. That's pretty important.
Druva supports Snowball, Commvault supports Snowball, Cloudberry supports Snowball because we have an S3 interface on the Snowball. So so anybody who supports an S3 connector should theoretically be able to make it work. The one thing with Snowballs is that you want to make an auxiliary copy of the data onto the Snowball. You don't want to move it there because if something happens to the device while it's in transit, then you would lose that copy of the data. We have folks actually in places where they haven't been able to get great networking capabilities. Like it's not that they choose not to do it. It's just it's not available. And they actually order Snowballs in pairs. They've run out of space on Prem. and they fill up both snowballs and send one back. So it's very cost effective to do that. It doesn't give you the same result as buying a big storage thing on-prem, but they have no interest in investing in that because they know that it's only a matter of time before they move all of their workloads into AWS. They're in that migration process, and the beginning of that migration process is getting their data protection foundation right.
Yep.
It's the world's largest USB drive.
That's right.
Approach, right?
For sure.
Yeah. All right. Peter asks about backups on my applications or containers or databases in the cloud not hosted on AWS. So I think that's actually not very complicated. If I'm a Veritas customer, a Commvault customer, I can do a backup from my Microsoft environment and use the connector and dump that over into AWS.
So yeah, and if it's a container, and if the container is part of like a private registry, then you want to back up that stuff, and you can do that with a file-based agent.
File-based agent. Yeah.
And then if you have a database, a lot of what you would describe as best practices depend on the database itself, right?
Yeah.
So the way that you would back up MySQL, use a MySQL agent, MS SQL, same thing.
Yep.
With Oracle, it gets a little bit more complicated because you've got more options. You can choose to go the RMAN route, like Rohan described at the beginning.
We actually have a picture.
Yeah, we're going to get to the database in just a second here.
We'll talk about that one in a second. Yeah.
Let me wrap up one last thing. Clarification on Veeam. Can Veeam from ASC Networking? Can Veeam go straight to Glacier? Do they have to go to S3 first today?
So
start with
Veeam,
today.
Veeam can't do any of that today
Because it doesn't have a connector.
It doesn't have a connector. You have to use the Our Storage Gateway product.
So it can't go directly, but you can go from Veeam to a VTL gateway.
Yep.
And then.
Yep. Or you could use the file gateway.
Yep. And then the gateway will put it into S3 and then migrate into.
If you use VTL, you can't just import it because it's written out in the VTL format. But if you use the file gateway, then you end up with disk images, and you can do an import there.
Okay, so let us know if that doesn't answer the question, and we can come back and clarify.
And if you are a Veeam user and you're invested in Veeam, I would say give it a little bit of time.
Yeah, sit tight.
Because we expect that there will be great news to share, real soon now. If you go look up real soon now, if you've never heard of it, it's an indeterminate period of time.
We like Veeam. We work closely with Veeam.
That's right.
Press them, ask them. They'll help you out.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so let's switch over to databases. We've got another amazing drawing here of the database world. So the question is, how do I apply all this in a database world? If I've got to protect my databases, what are my options? So here we have a scenario using
Oracle.
Yep.
Yep. So before I even go into that, I'll couch it like this. So this is a fairly general example with Oracle. A very specific example with Oracle. However, it can be generalized. And,
to any database, actually.
To any database. And there are just certain components that will be specific to that database engine. So just keep that in mind. A lot of it is documented in our online docs, so you can take a look by database engine at some of these details. So, so with Oracle, you can use RMAN, which a lot of administrators are very familiar with. On-prem, you're probably using RMAN already, and you're backing up your database to maybe a NAS.
Outside of any replication you might be doing.
Right, outside of any replication you might be doing. And I think I mentioned it earlier, Oracle provides Oracle Secure Backup Cloud Module. That Cloud Module understands how to talk to S3 natively. So from on-prem, you can install the Cloud Module, enter in your keys for AWS, and the destination bucket that you want to actually drop that backup into, and Oracle Secure Backup will perform the backup to S3, just like it will do a standard RMAN, just like you do a standard RMAN file path.
Yeah.
Yep, and perform a backup there. Now, let's say you've decided you're going to move that Oracle database into AWS. You have a couple of options. Am I going to run that on RDS, fully managed, or am I going to run it on EC2? And
scenarios number 2 and 3.
Scenarios number 2 and 3. Yep. And so
it's a trade-off.
Yeah, you have some trade-offs, right? With RDS, I've got a fully managed infrastructure around that database engine, but all I have really available to me is snapshots for my backups.
RDS snapshots.
RDS snapshots. Mm-hmm. Yep. So RDS snapshots are full volume snapshot. Right. So if you need a more granular means of backing up that database, you may have to consider running that database on EC2. And again, you have RMAN.
But you could do both.
You could do both.
We have what we didn't draw here is we didn't draw DMS.
We didn't draw DMS. So yeah, so
Finish this and then we'll talk.
Yeah, so you can
if I do build it myself,
Yeah, you can
I've got
build it
EC2
yourself.
with Oracle running on top.
Absolutely. And then again, you can use secure backup to run your backups directly to S3.
But it also applies to Galera clusters. It applies to
Yep.
Postgres. It applies to
Absolutely.
MSSQL Server.
Insert database flavor here.
Insert database flavor
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
Yeah.
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 So from that perspective, for the backup admin, it's simple. It's something that they're very familiar with. And then we've got option 4, right? So maybe I do want to run. Maybe I want to run my database on RDS and have a fairly fully managed infrastructure, but I may have some requirements some situations where I do need to get to and restore very specific databases on that engine, right? So I could use our DMS, our data migration tool, to replicate that database from RDS to Oracle running on EC2.
Or you can even change engines. In some cases, you've got
If you want,
schemas.
I can.
We've got a schema conversion tool there
Absolutely.
that will actually evaluate the schema on the source and on the destination, and it'll say, okay,
Yep.
or evaluate the schema on the source rather, and you tell it what platform you want to go to, and it'll tell you what it thinks the likelihood is of
That's
you
right.
being able to easily move it there.
Exactly.
It turns out that a lot of people who use CMS just leave it up. And they leave it up as just a replication mechanism. We see a lot of people, if they're migrating a database or they're trying to back up a database from on-prem to the cloud, they start the DMS replication. There's a couple different modes of replication, but so there's back up to a certain point. There's do it continuously. There's catch up and then do it continuously. And so once you're current, you can then flip where the writable component is. And so you can run the real deal in the cloud, and you can have replication go the other way for reporting purposes, for example. We know people who do that for security reasons because they want to say, well, what if we pull the plug on the cloud stuff, and we want to be able to have our data for security reasons, for audit reasons. We also see people who have OLTP workloads in one environment and they have OLAP requirements in another. And so they've sized their on-prem infrastructure for the OLTP stuff, not for the OLAP. And the OLAP is going off of, let's say, all their data, and the OLTP stuff has only got enough I/O capabilities for the OLTP portion. So they use DMS to replicate stuff into the cloud, and they run their OLAP on the cloud. In the RMAN case, where you might have replication, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be Oracle per se, but you might have replication between your primary and your standby, and maybe you have a tertiary one. Usually you would stick something like RMAN in the middle. With DMS, it doesn't have to be in the middle. It can be anywhere. So your replication topology and where you do your backups can be totally separated. So people who want the benefits of having the managed RDS implementation, but also want to be able to get that granular restore, can set up RDS and then use DMS to replicate that to an EC2 host where they have their agent-based stuff, and they can pull out that transactional record stuff.
Can you stick a few more acronyms in that sentence?
I'll try
It's
hard.
complicated enough. So I drew it on you because this is live and we're on the fly here. But in reality, I could draw another orange arrow that goes from the on-prem into the cloud with
For
DMS,
sure. Absolutely.
giving me the granularity on this side and the replication.
And there are
tree.
limitations. Like, I mean, if you're on a specific version of Oracle that, like, maybe you're using a financial application and they only support XYZ version of Oracle that we don't have in RDS, then you might decide to run it in EC2 for that reason. Or there might be a data type. Like, I think it supports it now, but for a long time it didn't support spatial records. And so you couldn't use DMS if you had spatial records, like stuff like that. So there are some one-offs, but for the vast majority of people, if you have MySQL or Postgres or Oracle or MSSQL, DMS is magic. And if you want to be able to get that granular backup and still get the benefits of using RDS, it's magic again.
So it's magic in terms of moving database X from here to there.
Yeah, it's very, very low overhead on the replication component.
Yep, and I can use that to drop it into RDS or put it onto a
sure.
hand-built version, and then I can switch and swap between those.
Yeah.
And
It's
or
like a
convert
Swiss Army
engines.
knife for
And or
databases.
convert.
And or convert engines if you want to migrate from Oracle to something else.
Yeah. We have a lot of customers who want to try out Aurora.
Aurora is
one of our. It is the Amazon created database engine, and Aurora is designed to scale to crazy amounts. And so for customers who say, my current application architecture is to write to, let's say, sharded PostgreSQL databases or something like that, and that just gets unmanageable after a while. They say, okay, I want to consolidate my database workload onto one database platform, Aurora Postgres support, for example. They would actually not just have to replicate the data, but they've got to sort out okay, data from this goes here, data from this goes here, and maybe you're using Postgres on-prem, you might have some views or some materialized views type things. Okay, this goes here and this goes here. And so DMS lets you actually specify that it's not just a like-for-like copy. It allows you to sort of interweave things the way you want to, and it manages that for you. So it turns out that people really love it, and they set it up and then they just leave it on. So and so with your backup infrastructure, if you believe that if you're in a situation where you're going to need granular backup of your database workload, the best thing to do is to make sure that you can accommodate that, but also put yourself in a situation where if something goes wrong with, let's say, your instance, that you're not going to have a risk associated with that. So using RDS for your actual production run makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. So there's another piece of all this that we haven't really talked about, which is file systems. Mm-hmm. And we have the Elastic file system, which is a Unix-compatible file system running in the cloud scale, fully managed. If I migrate my NAS from on-prem into the cloud, through maybe with a snowball or some other technique or direct connect, I've got all these files sitting there. What do I do now? How do I protect that?
So I'll give you one option, right? So one option is to man up that file system and use a host with a backup agent on it to back that up in kind of your more traditional pattern, right? So I'm going to send the backups through my media server and write them down and have them cataloged in that fashion.
And so that client has to have read access to all of the data.
Read access, correct. So it has to be able to read that file system at its full scale, right? So that's one option there. Another option that is to actually replicate the EFS file system, for example. And we actually provide a quick start on our webpage for customers to be able to implement that.
And a quick start is an automated way of deploying something in your account that's production ready.
Okay.
Yep. And then you can keep 2 EFS file systems in sync. Which pattern you choose is really going to depend on how you want to protect the data and whether you need access from maybe 2 separate file systems or what the actual workload is that you're trying to protect. So you're going to need to kind of think through how it is you really want to protect the data that's in EFS. EFS is a distributed file system, right? So it's fairly well protected as is.
And it runs. Tell me more about that on an AWS infrastructure. Like I'm accustomed to having clustered NetApps on-prem. That's pretty good.
Well, we're a bit more distributed than a clustered NetApp, right?
Just realities of what you're talking about when you talk about cloud scale.
Yeah. So EFS can scale. It's petabyte scale. So and you don't have to worry about actually scaling the infrastructure on the covers. So
and you only pay for what you're using.
And you only pay for what you're using. So and now you can either.
And I'm a diehard NetApp fan. I love that.
Yeah. Nothing against NetApp. Just different.
But being able to pay for only what you're using. Oh my God, it's amazing.
And you can even kind of dial it in as far as do I need it for performance or do I need it for do I have a very well understood performance profile and I can actually use kind of a cheaper tier essentially of EFS. So
we have a lot of people doing it themselves too, or using partner products.
Yeah.
And so the way that you would back those up, the same thing applies where they usually have a replication mechanism built in. Or they have persistent mechanism built in, or you go do it from a client perspective, right? So if you're using like Weka.io, for example, they actually give you the ability to take a snapshot and upload it directly to S3. Now, again, it's the snapshot, meaning it's opaque unless you've mounted it on the cluster. SoftNAS is a really interesting replication mechanism. You can use NetApp in the cloud. Cloud volumes on tap.
On tap cloud,
and in fact, if you're using if you have like a second site and you just have NetApps there and you're just receiving SnapMirror data and you never fail over to it, what a great thing to do in the cloud. Because the way SnapMirror works is that it's one way from a versioning perspective. So if you're on an older version on-prem and you have a newer version in the cloud, you can still replicate to it, but you couldn't replicate the other way. So failing over would be a one-way operation. And I mention that because it's important if you didn't know that. If you're as an app administrator, you would want to know that before you made the decision to fail over. But we have plenty of people who actually use the NetApp Cloud Volumes ONTAP, which is an AMI-based deployment of ONTAP in AWS, and sometimes they deploy it in one AZ, sometimes they deploy it in multi-AZ. But the idea is that you can sort of use the same set of tools. So if you weren't keen on switching over to EFS because you didn't have, let's say, like multi-protocol access, for example, maybe you had a workload that required multi-protocol access, meaning that you had one set of data that you could access via both CIFS and SMB, and you still wanted to be able to back that stuff up. You could replicate it to Cloud Volumes on tap, and then you could even tier it to S3 using their S3 tiering feature set. And you can do that from on-prem too. It's called Fabric Pool. But then you can use all of the traditional NetApp integrations with the backup providers to actually back up that data, not only via NDMP copy, but also by, like in Isilon, Commvault's got a thing called OnePass, which uses the Isilon API to be able to stub stuff. So you could say, okay, I want to back this up, and then if it's old enough, I want to archive it, send it up to S3, for example.
So now we're starting to kind of get into the disaster recovery scenario on things, and we've talked earlier a little bit about how backup and recovery are bleeding into disaster recovery as you look at this cloud piece more and more. Suggestions, thoughts, plans, ways to think about this?
We've seen some new stuff, like Cloud Endure is a battle-tested DR solution, and they recently released a backup solution, which is sort of meeting in the middle the backup folks like Veritas, who came out with VRP, that's a disaster recovery and migration tool. Cloud Mobility, I think, is the migration component. And then Commvault's got LiveSync, and they've also got continuous replication. And so that whole sort of meet in the middle thing does represent that the industry is recognizing that customers need not just the ability to take backups of their data sets, but to then repurpose that data for other purposes. So what Rohan was saying about seeding your migration, seeding it with the backup, these folks are in the logical place to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Got it. So you can, what used to be attacks, a bunch of data sitting away on a tape drive,
that's right,
is now turning into value add.
Yeah, it's kind of like taking a cost center and turning it into a profit center, which is sort of the AWS way of looking at things. But but for the backup guys, it is, right? Because it's like, okay, I'm protecting all of this data, and you have a migration plan. Why don't we just capitalize the same thing that we're paying for?
Sure. Or that backuap sitting in the cloud becomes my DR plan, depending on my software.
There was a question about licensing and about that there's different ways to license things. So sometimes people license by capacity, and if you license by capacity, it's often an all-you-can-eat from a feature perspective. And sometimes people license by particular feature sets. It's going to vary per person what SKU effectively you decided to buy. But a lot of it depends on what you want your RPO and what you want your RTO to be. So, like for example, in the case of Cloud Endure, they were traditionally very, very low RTO and very, very low RPO. Right? So we wanted that like sub 10-minute failover to the cloud, you could get it. There are other workloads though that don't require that. So Cloud Endure came out with another SKU, right? Another product that would allow you to say, okay, well, maybe a couple hours is okay, right? And now with their backup, emergence of their backup workload, you can imagine that would be something that might give way to like more tiers, right?
So they've come down the stack, and others have
gone up, and they're all meeting in the middle.
Yeah.
It's really just a question of what works for your workload, and you should totally bake off. Right, the customer should say, "All right, I'm going to use. I know I'm going to have to solve this problem. I might have an investment in one solution, and that's a good reason to start with that solution. But if you're starting from a greenfield situation, you say, not only am I not protecting my data today, but I don't have a plan for migration. It's a great opportunity for people to see which things are going to work best for them.
It kind of leans towards how do I test? Like a bake-off is just a bunch of tests. How do I actually test that this stuff is working? Is there a simple, easy way?
Well, if you don't have any automation in place,
get started.
Spin up an AMI.
It is. It's actually that simple, right? So, running a test is really just a matter of either using one of the patterns that we've talked about, which for most of you probably already have the capabilities on-prem within your licensing, or if you don't, then use the AMIs that we provide or go through our marketplace, right? And just spin up the infrastructure and try it out, right? Try to apply your business rules to applying those backups and see how it works, right? The barrier to entry is very low. Right? You're only going to pay for what you use. So that's why we always say, let's just get started and give it a shot.
I would add to that a lot of people think about, okay, I'm going to back up my data to the cloud, and then when I do a restore, I'll restore in the cloud. Don't forget that the data or the workloads that you've restored also need to be protected. So restore them in a way that you've maintained your backup infrastructure and that you have a plan once you've effectively migrated those workloads in. You don't want to be in a situation where you had 2 sites, you shut down your primary site and you failed over, and then you don't have a plan for what to do, right?
Yep.
So there was a company called Cloud Ranger that also got bought by Druva, and they specialized in just automating that failover between regions.
Yep.
And one of the things that we've learned from customers is, and anybody who's ever had to manage a production environment knows this, if you haven't automated your restoration process, it will fail when you need it.
It's too much.
For sure, it will fail.
Much room for error. Yeah, okay. Way too much room for error.
There are applications out there that like follow these 48 steps to get things going, and then and sometimes you can't get away from that, but usually you can automate even those things. And so if you haven't automated things, going to the cloud is a great opportunity to do so, because all the resource stuff is going to be API driven anyway. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're gonna have sort of like this organic automation that you end up building.
Yeah. Let's give some folks let's give some ideas, right? So let's go for something fairly simple. Let's say I have a media server fail, right? That's something that happens all the time. Fail a media server in AWS and have some automation rebuild it for you.
Yeah.
Or deploy a CloudFormation template, pull out the AMI from the library.
Or even simpler than that, we have these things called autoscale groups, and autoscale groups can be used to go wide on stuff, but they can also be used where the minimum and the maximum value is the same.
It's the same, yeah.
Right. So if you set the min and the max value to 1, then that one AMI, if you say I've got a media server deployed in an availability zone and I've got all my clients mapped to that one, and let's say that something goes away, right? Maybe the instance, the hardware that it's on fails. Autoscale group you specify how long you wait before you do that. You specify what the health checks are, etc. But you can have autoscale group just restart that AMI on another host.
Wow.
Or
on the fly,
you can't do that.
I'm telling you.
You can't do that on Prem, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess you would have a cluster of virtualization.
What do you do on Prem when you have a performance issue, right? Your backup servers are kind of full tilt; they don't have any more capacity. If you haven't been planning ahead and get the infrastructure in on time in order to support your backups, now you're probably failing from a compliance perspective. Use that same capability with the autoscaling groups to scale out your host. And pump up the volume on it. So
okay, all right, nice. Last question here. We got to wrap it up. How do I get help? What do I do if there's a problem? Who do I call? There are support plans. What do I do?
So if you're managing the data yourself, actually, let me start by saying that if you don't have support with AWS, if you're using AWS and you don't have support, I feel like you're probably not getting all out of it what you could, right? We have a lot of services like Trusted Advisor, and we have developer support, we have small business support, very affordable. For enterprises, we have enterprise support. You get a dedicated TAM, and for environments where you have hundreds or thousands of accounts and you want to make sure you're always following best practices, that's what the support organization is there for. They're there to make sure that you have a smooth experience. For the ISVs that you might be working with, we've trained them on how to work with AWS. And if you go look for whatever application you're looking for, and you look for cloud best practices, you're going to find it there. There's going to be screenshots about what to do, what knobs to turn, what knobs not to turn, and our support organization will work with their support organization.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say lastly, don't forget about our managed service partners, right? So they can come in and help you actually design this. So if you're not familiar with
even
designing,
AMS,
not familiar with designing just the AWS side of things, they can help you get started. Maybe you want to kind of go big and actually develop a migration strategy. They can help you with that as well, right? So that's a good place.
Consulting partners, MSPs for your backup providers. We also have Amazon Managed Services for enterprises. ProServe. We have our ProServe folks. And then if you don't want any infrastructure to manage, if you say, I'm done with managing backup infrastructure, Druva is a software as a service backup solution. So, and you basically install agents on your hosts, and that's the end of the story. There's no infrastructure to manage.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for sending your questions in and rolling along with us as we did this on the fly. Thank you boys both for helping us out here. And I think that wraps us up. I'll hand it back over.